Right, I'd like to speak this afternoon about what's traditionally been called the Grooming Gang scandal, is now being called the Rape Gang scandal. Thank you. Now, there is actually a nuance to grooming gangs, which is important. Yes, it does end up with gang rape, but the whole point about the grooming gangs is they worked on kids by bribing them with vodka, drugs, like cannabis and other substances, and wormed their way into their affections, starting as young as 11 or 12, but not necessarily striking till very much later. So when you say rape gang, it's not a violent sort of knife-to-the-throat job. It's a long, sustained program of winning the affection of girls, so they end up believing that the perpetrators are their best friends and not in any way criminals. They would actually defend them, even against their own parents. Now, as usual, the crimes are in some ways a lot easier to accept than the cover-up. And what I want to concentrate on is that there's a sort of time list, a chronology of the knowledge of these crimes, and then there's the whole question of the cover-up and how it's inextricably linked with the Labour Party. These crimes occurred in areas where Labour weren't just strong, they were absolutely guaranteed to be in power for decades, so that officials in councils knew that if all went well, they would never have their connivance with the crimes discovered. No senior politician from places like West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire in particular, and some of the Lancashire constabularies has ever been prosecuted. Neither has any senior council leader. Many have been forced to resign when the evidence comes out of their connivance with the crimes, but none has ever been sent to prison. And what campaigners these days are anxious about is that there should be some consequences for the officials who've collaborated with all this. And it's not going to happen as long as you've got a Labour government, because, as you know, they've rejected a national inquiry, and Bradford Council, which is Labour-run, has rejected even a local inquiry. So I want to go back to when it all started. It was definitely going by the 1990s. My source of evidence, rather like Paul's, are based on the Rotherham grooming scandal, because that's been the most investigated. I've worked my way through about 2.5 books. There's Jane Senior's Broken and Betrayed, which I'm afraid I regard as very, very partial and self-glorifying. There's a survivor's account, Sammy Woodhouse's, which is probably the most famous account, and there's Sarah Wilson's, which I'm just getting into. But this points out that the grooming was underway back in the 1990s. Sammy Woodhouse's exploiter, abuser, Arshid Hussain, who eventually, along with other members of his family, his 2 brothers, Basharat and Banras, his cousin Sagir, and 2 white women collaborators who acted as procuresses, if you like, guarded the safe homes where the people were abused. They all went down for 102 years in 2016. Another group of people from Rotherham, about 20 defendants, were found guilty of violating about 21 victims, and they went down for a total of 360 years. But these are, if you like, the actual perpetrators. The people who have not been sent to prison are all the police officers who turned a blind eye, and the council officials who said you mustn't call Asian taxi drivers Asian taxi drivers. It's actually in one of the accounts. I think it's Jane Senior's. She said council officials were instructed to refer to people from a particular geographical location engaged in a particular occupation. They weren't allowed to say most of the perpetrators are Asian taxi drivers and takeaway owners. Anyway, the crimes came to public notice back in the 1990s because one of the assistants to Jane Senior, as far back as the 1990s, was commissioned in Bradford to look into streets and lanes, which was child sexual exploitation in the back streets of Bradford. There was a burst of activity, largely due to people in the BNP, in both Bradford and Keighley and Rotherham in the early 2000s. But it's been erased from history. Nobody on the TV, as far as I know, except of all people, Gawain Towler, has ever mentioned that the BNP were looking into grooming as far back as that. And it's obvious why, because 20 years have been wasted. If those initiatives had been followed through, then 20 years of suffering might have been avoided. Now, in the case of Bradford and Keighley, my colleague, Angela, was approached by a group called Mothers Against Paedophiles, which are a group of mothers of victims, and asked to stand in the 2004 elections. Channel 4 had already commissioned a programme called Sex and the City, which was looking into the whole question of grooming in Keighley. Almost everybody in Keighley knew it was going on. Social workers and junior police officers were coming up to us saying, I've got this terrible problem. This grooming is going on, but my superiors don't want to know about it. If they knew that I was talking to you, I'd get the sack. This was going on a large scale. People were aware of it, but the official line was, there is no grooming in Keighley. The Chief Constable of West Yorkshire at the time, I think his name was Caldwell, insisted that the Channel 4 documentary be broadcast after the May 2004 elections so that the BNP did not profit. And this comes out again in Jane Senior's account, where she despises the BNP and the EDL and said they were worming their way into the victims' affections. They were wheedling information out of council offices by posing as journalists. This is coming from a person who is so absolutely dedicated to Labour that she cannot see outside the walls of the box. She cannot see that Labour is the problem and will never be the solution. She ended up being a Labour councillor. And her account is so distorted. Again, she attacks UKIP for making grooming an issue in about 2014 and says this was dirty tricks politics. UKIP should not have addressed the question of the 1,400 victims in Rotherham because it was dirty politics, undermining Labour's control of Rotherham. That gives you an idea of the sort of perspective you have to cope with. Anyway, none of the accounts ever mentions Marlene Guest. Now, Marlene Guest is now dead. She died of cancer, and when she did, a Labour councillor said, ding dong, the wicked witch is dead. This was a council in which the deputy leader was a relative of the main rape gang leader, the main grooming gang leader, Arshid Hussain. His relative, Jahangir Akhtar, was the deputy leader of the council and the vice chair of the police scrutiny body. Well, when you've got the vice chair of the scrutiny of the police in the hands of somebody who is related to the main criminal involved, you don't have to think very hard to understand why anti-grooming in Rotherham was getting precisely nowhere. Time and time again in the accounts of survivors, you hear that one of the abusers gets a phone call from a policeman saying there's a raid on its way, hide all the evidence, from a policeman. Policemen are actually named. I mean, we're not talking about anonymous individuals. A PC Sadat is quoted as taking bribes. And other policemen are taking bribes in the form of drugs from the crooks. They're perfectly well aware of the grooming going on, but they are happy to look in the other direction. They call the victims white slags, white trash, and say that what they're doing is a lifestyle choice. How exactly a 12-year-old girl can make a lifestyle choice to be gang raped on multiple occasions and trafficked all over the country is rather hard to fathom. Presumably these policemen have never heard of the age of consent, because most of the victims are well under 16. Anyway, as I say, there was a burst of activity in the early 2000s. Marlene Guest was raising a fuss in Rotherham. Angela and myself put forward a motion in Bradford District Council that the council addressed the grooming gang issue. It was about November 2005. I cannot recall better than that because the records have been destroyed. What happened was that the Tory Chief Whip, Anne Hawkesworth, got to her feet and said, I propose that this motion be dismissed immediately without discussion, and appealed for a show of hands. So all the hands of the Labour, Conservative, Liberal and Green councillors shot up. That's 86 out of 90. that the motion be dismissed without discussion, so no facts could be presented, and it ceased to exist historically. So if you look in the records of Bradford Council for November 2005, there's nothing there, because it's held never to have existed. I believe that there may be some record in Keighley Town Council, because Angela, having won a town council seat, also raised the issue. I know very well, because she was so nervous because of the intimidation she was getting, that she asked me to read it out. And that raised a fuss in the town council. They said, district councillors can't be present. You've got to leave the room immediately. So the whole thing collapsed. At the same time, remember that Angela was being subjected to intimidation and harassment by people on her estate. When I rang around the council saying, will you please condemn the violence directed at my fellow councillor, Angela Clark, the Tories agreed and said it was a dreadful thing. Labour, David Green, put the phone down and said, I never want to hear from you again. I do not speak to the BNP. The Liberal said she deserves all she gets. The Liberal, John Briggs, said she deserves all she gets. You BNP are scum and filth, and she deserves what she gets. Her daughter, Zoe, was being beaten up on the way home from school, and Angela had to have her home alarmed and set up with CCTVs by a BNP member who was an electrician. That's how bad it was, and in the end, after 2 years, she resigned from the council because she just had enough of the intimidation and harassment. At that time, she'd been picked by Nick Griffin to lead a task force into grooming across Yorkshire and Lancashire. Anyway, to return to Rotherham, something must have been suspected because one of Jane Senior's collaborators was commissioned to write a report in 2006 for South Yorkshire Police. But the really interesting thing is what happened on the 18th of April 2002. A senior solicitor called Adele Weir had written a report, a massive report, on grooming in Rotherham. She made the mistake of tipping off the council and the police that it was going to be critical of them. The Deputy Chief Constable of South Yorkshire, who is named Christine Burberry or something like that, Beery, tore into her at a meeting and basically shouted and screamed at her in front of the public and said that she was completely useless and that the report was disgusting, etc., etc. The night after, somebody went in and stole the report from the Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council offices. It was the night of the 18th of April 2002. Jane Senior and Adele Weir went into the offices to find that the report had vanished entirely and that the computer had been wiped clean of any record of the report. In order to do that, the perpetrator had to have the keys to 2 doors in the Rotherham Council offices, to have got past the security officer at the front desk, and to know the password to the computer. So we're not talking about a casual sneak thief. We're talking about somebody senior in Rotherham Borough Council stole and destroyed this report. It was never reported to the police, and nobody has ever found out who the perpetrator was. But the later behaviour of Rotherham Council makes a lot of sense of the fact that it was a senior official in Rotherham Borough Council who stole the report. That was in 2002. Then basically nothing very much happens, except there was a report commissioned, Every Child Matters, at around 2006. The trail goes cold, and then there's a burst of activity, which is when most of the world, not just Britain, learned of the existence of the grooming gangs. The Home Affairs Select Committee, acting after numerous reports had reached them, ironically led by Keith Vaz MP, hardly the person you'd pick for the job, chaired by Keith Vaz, interrogated the main officials from Rotherham Borough Council, like the head of the council, the head of the children's services, and senior policemen, the 2 chief constables most involved, in October 2012. By that stage, Andrew Norfolk was getting involved, the Times reporter who opened the whole can of worms up, and who later got Reporter of the Year award, I think in 2015. Andrew Norfolk interrogated Sammy Woodhouse and published her story on the 23rd of August 2013, and it made worldwide news. A year later, Alex J was commissioned to do a report. which came out on the 26th of August 2014, a year later from Sammy Woodhouse's account, and noted that probably in Rotherham alone 1,400 victims were known to exist. Now, if you compare that with the number of convictions, it's in just about double figures. So most of the perpetrators have escaped. If you look at the numbers involved, Arshid Hussain was sentenced in early 2016, January or February 2016, for 35 crimes. He was sentenced to 35 years for about 14 or 15 victims. The number of actual trials relative to the number of known victims is absolutely out of proportion. It must be something like 90% of the criminals have escaped any sort of charge. Anyway, Louise Casey was then commissioned. You've probably heard of her. She used to be Children's Commissioner or something like that. She was commissioned to write a report specifically on Rotherham Council, which came out in February 2015, and it reported that Rotherham Council was not fit for purpose, whereupon the entire council cabinet resigned in late February, and Eric Pickles, ironically the ex-leader of the council in Bradford while all this was going on, who then escaped to Essex, I think, to a nice safe Tory seat where he didn't have to cope with quite so much flack, he installed commissioners. Around the same time, Jahangir Akhtar, that's the deputy leader of council and the vice chair of the Police Scrutiny Commission, who was a relative of Arshid Hussain, the gang leader, he resigned. David Cameron himself followed the matter quite closely and asked some of the victims to see him in March 2015. And then, as I say, the trial concluded of the specific gang of 5 or 6 people, led by Arshid Hussain. They got 102 years, others got 360. So what were the authorities doing all this time? Well, as I say, back in the early days, the police themselves regarded the witnesses as unreliable. They refused to prosecute. They turned a blind eye to what was going on. They saw people committing these crimes and did nothing about it. As we all know, it got worse than that. One mother who saw an assailant orally rape her daughter rushed across and shouted, "You bastard, get off my daughter." Guess who got prosecuted? The mother. She was told that her other children would be taken off her because she was an unreliable mother, for using this expression, and she was told if she didn't attend a diversity and equality training course that she would forfeit her kids. Sammy Woodhouse's father found out where his daughter was being assaulted by 20 Pakistani groomers, went round and brayed on the doors. He was warned by the police that there would be serious consequences. Other people were actually, in Lancashire and so on, they were threatened with prosecution. He was braying on the door of the house in which the Arshid Hussain gang were assaulting his daughter, and the police threatened to arrest him. They did nothing about the criminals. In the case of the oral rapist, he was actually let off by the police and the mother prosecuted. They were perfectly well aware of what was going on. They had, of course, observed men hanging around the gates of schools, men driving around with teenage girls in their cars. These people were going to seedy hotels and bed and breakfasts and checking in. A man, possibly in his 30s and 40s, but often in his 60s and 70s, with a teenage girl who was clearly of a different ethnic group. In only one case does Sammy Woodhouse recall that the hotel receptionist said, "There's something funny going on here, I'm not accepting your booking." Every other case, it was simply cash is cash. But it gets worse because Rotherham Borough Council, when the report came out and they realised that somebody had provided the reporters, like Andrew Norfolk, with inside information, then spent £20,000 on hiring a solicitor to track down the whistleblower. They weren't interested in the fact that they'd completely messed up on guarding the children of Rotherham. They were interested in the fact that Rotherham's reputation had suffered because the scandal had broken in the Times. Their main interest was to find the whistleblower and punish them, not to find the criminals. So, as I say, it's a pretty disgusting mess to look at, but to my mind, and I think probably to a lot of your minds, the cover-up is far more important than the crimes. Yes, the crimes are vile and disgusting. It's now believed by Louise Casey, for instance, that there were probably more like 2,000 victims in Rotherham alone. Multiply that by the fact that GB News has reported it's probably been happening in 50 cities and towns across England, and you can see the scale of the issue. It is not a minor crime, and equally, it's very hard to say it's just a tiny minority of a particular ethnic group. It's much more than that. If you look at the percentages in Telford, they're quite a staggeringly high number of the people involved. So I think the question of some sort of collective cultural guilt has got to be raised. Our judicial system is premised on the idea that individuals commit crimes, that if you punish the individual, then everything's solved. Somebody commits a burglary or a rape, he's sentenced to prison, and that's the end of the matter. But we're talking now about a case in which people close ranks across a whole community and deny that anything's going on, in which when people come out of prison, they're welcomed back into the family and into the community as if nothing had ever happened. They're not ostracised. They're not told, go away, we don't want to see you ever again. Imams do not broadcast from the mosque. This is an intolerable business, and anybody who does it will go to hell. You see with the problem, there is some sort of collective responsibility that has to be addressed, but our judicial system cannot cope with that. It can only address that of individual guilt. And as I've said, only a tiny proportion of these people have ever been punished, or ever will be. It would just tie up too many police resources to look at the historical crimes. And as I say, the final thing that really gets on your nerves is the attitude of people like Jane Senior. As I say, she regards the BNP and the EDL for raising this issue as being racist and as being playing politics. That's what she accuses Nigel Farage and UKIP of. She says, when they came to Rotherham and said 1,400 reasons why you should vote UKIP, she says that was dirty tricks politics, because they were trying to break the grip, the monolithic grip that Labour had on the town. Jane Senior doesn't actually say she's a Labour supporter, though she later became a Labour councillor. She says, like most northern working class industrial or post-industrial people, we voted for a particular party. My dad only once voted Tory and regretted it the rest of his life. You're talking about a mindset that simply cannot see that Lord Acton's famous dictum is true. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. As long as Labour is guaranteed to be in charge of these northern cities and towns, nothing will ever change, because they will close ranks. The idea that a local inquiry can solve the problems of Oldham, the problems of Oldham only came to public notice because independent councillors, you'll have seen some of them on GB News, challenged the Labour monopoly and were able to force through motions to address grooming. If it had stayed in Labour hands, there would not even have been the limited progress that's been made so far. One has to ask questions about what the MPs were doing. Jane Senior quotes the McShane, who is constantly on GB News these days. If you remember, he served time in prison for fraud, expenses fraud, but apparently he's been welcomed back into the fold. Dennis McShane said that in his 18 years of MP for Rotherham, which goes on into he finished about 2012 or 2015 or something, I think when the mass resignations took place, he never had a single case of child sexual exploitation brought to his notice. He couldn't remember any such event. He was replaced by Sarah Champion, who has at least made some effort to get to the bottom of the issue, but is still disregarded by the Labour hierarchy. She had to attack Yvette Cooper the other day when Yvette Cooper raised the issue and tried to smooth over it. Back in the day, it wasn't just the BNP that were addressing the issue in Keighley. Anne Cryer spoke out. For that, she was humiliated and ostracised and downgraded by her own party. The rest of the Labour Party closed ranks trying to get Anne Cryer to shut up. So there is a culture problem, but it's a culture problem also within the Labour Party. They do not wish to admit their participation in the cover-up. And it's hard to imagine they ever will, because look how many reputations are at stake. Angela Rayner, what was she doing in her part of Manchester? I believe it overlapped Oldham considerably. Did she, A, not know what was going on, in which case she couldn't have been a very effective MP, because everybody else in Oldham knew what was going on, or B, was she complicit? There's really no third way out of it. She either knew or she didn't know, and if she did know, why did she not go to the police and do something about it? But remember that Greater Manchester Police have enough people in their own ranks that they need to weed out. When the local inquiry asked 5 senior police officers to testify, they simply pleaded the fifth and said that the Commission had no power to require them to testify, and so they simply said, we're not saying anything. Only a national inquiry with full statutory powers can get to the bottom of this, but of course Labour does not want it. And as long as it has 400 MPs, it can easily see off any chance of getting an inquiry demanded by the other parties, because it can simply vote them down. So that's the situation in which we find ourselves, and that's why people in the British Democrats are doing a valuable role in simply keeping the issue alive, along with GB News. If the mainstream press were in charge of this, and there were no GB News and no British Democrats and other people, it would have been buried forever from sight. And when the last person died that ever knew anything about it, then historians of the future would never know there had been a problem. It is really that bad. And that's why, as I say, I'm trying to talk to somebody on the Daily Mail about looking back into the events of around 2005-06, when we did propose a motion to look at the child grooming issue, and I hope that she will get to the bottom of it. But as I say, a lot of the witnesses are now 20 years on. It's going to be difficult to get anything pushed through. People who are responsible will have died or gone to care homes or whatever and cannot be prosecuted. 20 years have been wasted, during which immeasurable amounts of suffering have been caused to people, with the authorities busy looking in the other direction. It's frankly a condemnation not only of one party, but of the whole political establishment, the whole body of councillors, MPs, police chiefs, and of course newspaper reporters. One thing I can't report is that the Telegraph and Argus, the Bradford paper, ever reported this issue until it was forced upon them. They didn't want to know about it. They're supposed to be investigative journalists. They didn't investigate anything. All the work's been done by people like Andrew Norfolk and more recently Charlie Peters. But the vast majority of journalists, what have they been doing and what are they going to do? Anyway, that's the summary of my report. I'm sorry if it's a bit disjointed, but I was expecting to go on last rather than first. So has anybody got any questions?